The airport was buzzing with travelers, announcements echoing through the speakers as people rushed to their gates. Among them was Olivia Carter, a bright-eyed 10-year-old girl holding her father's hand tightly. She was excited. It was her first time flying first class. Her father, Jonathan Carter, was a calm and composed man in his early 40s, dressed in a sharp navy suit. He exuded an air of quiet authority, but to Olivia, he was just her loving dad, always making sure she had everything she needed. As they approached the gate, Olivia's excitement grew. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks, imagining the soft seats, the warm blankets, and, most importantly, the endless snacks and drinks she had heard about. As they boarded the plane, she looked around in awe. The seats were bigger than she expected, the lighting was soft and inviting, and everything smelled expensive. Jonathan helped Olivia settle into her seat near the window, smiling at her excitement. "Ready for takeoff, princess?" he asked. She nodded eagerly, kicking her little legs as she looked out the window. The flight attendants were moving around, helping passengers get comfortable. One of them, a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform, walked down the aisle with a polite but distant smile. Her name tag read, Ms. Lauren. As she stopped beside their row, Olivia looked up at her with a cheerful grin. "Excuse me, can I have some juice, please?" she asked politely. Ms. Lauren's smile faltered for a moment as her eyes scanned Olivia. She barely acknowledged the request, shifting her attention to another passenger. Olivia frowned, confused, but thought maybe the flight attendant hadn't heard her. A few minutes passed, and Olivia saw Ms. Lauren serving drinks to other passengers in first class. Sparkling water, wine, soda. Everyone around her seemed to be getting what they wanted. She tried again. Excuse me, ma'am? Can I have some juice now, please?" Ms. Lauren turned to Olivia with an impatient sigh. "We're serving priority passengers first," she said curtly before walking away. Olivia blinked in surprise. That didn't make sense. Weren't they also priority passengers? They were in first class, just like everyone else. She turned to her father, confusion written all over her face. Jonathan's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something sharp and observant. He had noticed. Minutes went by, and Olivia watched as Ms. Lauren continued serving drinks, skipping past their row again and again. When she saw another child, a little boy with sandy brown hair, being handed a juice box without even having to ask, her heart sank. Why was she being ignored? Jonathan leaned in and whispered, "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Olivia hesitated before nodding slowly, but he wasn't convinced. He had been watching the entire time, noticing how Ms. Lauren's attitude changed depending on who she was speaking to. He had seen this kind of behavior before, and he had a strong feeling he knew what was happening. But instead of reacting immediately, he remained silent, letting the situation unfold. Olivia, however, wasn't ready to give up. She straightened her shoulders and spoke a little louder, determined to be heard. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I please have some juice?" Ms. Lauren finally turned, this time with a look of irritation. "We don't have juice right now," she said flatly, before moving on without another word. Olivia's heart dropped. She had seen the juice just moments ago. She had watched other passengers receive it. She wasn't sure what she had done wrong, but the feeling in her chest was heavy. She turned to her dad, her voice quieter now. "Daddy, I don't think she likes me." Jonathan took a slow breath, his jaw tightening slightly. He reached for Olivia's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said in a calm but firm voice. "We'll handle it." Olivia didn't understand what he meant, but something about the way he spoke made her feel safe. Meanwhile, Ms. Lauren continued her work, completely unaware of who she had just dismissed. She had no idea that the man sitting next to Olivia, the man she had treated like any other passenger, was not just any traveler. He was the owner of the airline, and he had seen everything. Jonathan remained calm, but his mind was working quickly. He had spent years building his airline, ensuring it was known for excellent service and respect toward every passenger. He believed that kindness and professionalism should be at the heart of everything. But right now, on his own flight, his daughter was being treated unfairly. And that was something he couldn't ignore. He watched Ms. Lauren closely as she continued moving down the aisle, chatting politely with other passengers, offering them drinks and snacks with a warm smile. Completely different from how she had spoken to Olivia. Jonathan had always been good at reading people, and he could see it clearly. She wasn't just having a bad day. This was intentional. Olivia fidgeted in her seat, her small fingers tracing the edge of her armrest. She wasn't sure what she had done wrong, but she could feel that something wasn't right. The way Ms. Lauren had looked at her, the way she spoke, it didn't feel like an accident. She had been ignored on purpose. "Daddy," she whispered, looking up at him. "Did I do something bad?" Jonathan turned to her, his expression softening. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "You did absolutely nothing wrong." She nodded slowly, but her eyes were still clouded with doubt. She looked around the cabin, watching the other passengers, wondering why she had been treated differently. It was a feeling she didn't fully understand, but it left a heavy weight in her chest. A few minutes later, another flight attendant passed by, a younger woman with dark brown hair tied neatly into a bun. She looked kind, her eyes warm as she smiled at passengers while checking on them. Jonathan saw an opportunity. "Excuse me," he said, catching her attention. "Could I get a juice for my daughter, please?" The flight attendant's smile didn't waver. "Of course, sir," she said immediately. "I'll bring it right over." Jonathan thanked her, and Olivia sat up a little straighter, feeling hopeful again. Maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe Ms. Lauren had just been too busy. But then, as the young flight attendant walked toward the galley, Ms. Lauren appeared in her path, stopping her with a quick whisper. Jonathan couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the way Ms. Lauren's expression hardened. She glanced toward their row for just a second before shaking her head. The younger flight attendant hesitated, then slowly nodded, turning back toward the other passengers. She never returned with the juice. Jonathan's grip on the armrest tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his life. The fair, the unjust, the arrogant, the humble. He had learned that patience was often the strongest weapon. But that patience had limits, especially when it came to his daughter. Olivia didn't say anything, but Jonathan saw the disappointment in her eyes. She had been excited, happy. Now, she just looked quiet. Small. He leaned in again. "You know what makes a great leader, Olivia?" he asked softly. She shook her head, looking up at him with curiosity. "A great leader watches," he said. "They listen. And when they see something wrong, they don't ignore it. They do something about it." Olivia thought about that for a moment. "So, are you going to do something?" Jonathan smiled slightly, brushing a curl away from her face. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "I am." But first, he wanted to see just how far Ms. Lauren was willing to go. The flight continued smoothly, at least for everyone else. Ms. Lauren moved through the cabin, attending to the first-class passengers with practiced ease. Jonathan observed her every move, noting how she responded differently to certain passengers. She was friendly and warm with some, distant and dismissive with others. At one point, Olivia tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, I need to use the restroom." Jonathan nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart. I'll be right here." She unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way toward the restroom near the front of the cabin. As she walked past Ms. Lauren, the flight attendant barely glanced at her, her lips pressed into a thin line. But as Olivia was returning to her seat, Jonathan noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Ms. Lauren had stepped into her path. The flight attendant bent down slightly, her voice just low enough that most passengers wouldn't hear. "You should stay in your seat from now on," she said, her tone clipped. Olivia blinked in surprise. Okay, she mumbled, quickly walking past her. Jonathan saw the way Olivia's shoulders had tensed. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel it. And that was enough. Ms. Lauren turned away, completely unaware that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his decision now crystal clear. He had given her a chance to correct her behavior. He had watched, listened, and waited. And now, it was time to act. A flight attendant treating a child differently was unacceptable. A flight attendant treating his daughter differently, on his airline, was a direct challenge. Ms. Lauren had no idea who she had just dismissed. No idea who she had been so quick to overlook. But she was about to find out. Jonathan sat back in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. His face remained calm, almost unreadable, but his mind was already working through the next steps. He wasn't just upset, he was disappointed. This wasn't just about a juice box. It wasn't about a simple mistake. It was about respect. It was about how people were treated when no one was watching, when no one was expecting consequences. Olivia remained quiet beside him, her usual excitement dimmed. She wasn't the type to make a scene, but Jonathan could see the way she kept glancing at Ms. Lauren from the corner of her eye. He knew that look, curiosity mixed with confusion, the kind of realization that didn't fully make sense to a 10-year-old but left an uneasy feeling in her chest. Meanwhile, Ms. Lauren continued her work as if nothing had happened. She smiled at other passengers, leaned in to listen carefully to their requests, laughed politely at their jokes. If someone were watching her for the first time, they might think she was excellent at her job. But Jonathan had seen past that act. A few rows away, an elderly man called for assistance, struggling to adjust his seat. Ms. Lauren walked over with her usual polite demeanor, helping him without hesitation. Jonathan noticed how quickly she responded, how her entire attitude shifted depending on who she was speaking to. That was the problem. She wasn't treating all passengers equally. A few minutes later, the young flight attendant from before walked past again, avoiding eye contact with Jonathan. He could tell she was uneasy, likely aware that something wasn't right. He had a feeling Ms. Lauren had spoken to her, but he wasn't sure what had been said. He decided to test something. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, keeping his tone light. The young woman hesitated before turning toward him. "Yes, sir?" Jonathan gave a friendly smile. "I was wondering if I could get some water for my daughter." She glanced toward the galley, then back at Jonathan. Of course, sir. I'll bring it right away." Jonathan nodded, watching carefully as she walked away. She disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin. A moment later, he saw Ms. Lauren step into the galley as well. He wasn't surprised when, just like before, the young flight attendant never returned. Jonathan sighed. That confirmed it. Ms. Lauren wasn't just acting on her own impulses. She was actively controlling how others behaved, ensuring that Olivia remained ignored. And worse, the younger attendant seemed too afraid to go against her. He glanced down at his daughter, who was now flipping through the in-flight magazine, pretending not to care. But he knew her well enough to see through that. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Olivia shrugged. "I guess. I just don't get it." "Get what?" She hesitated before speaking. "Why she doesn't like me." Jonathan felt a pang in his chest. His daughter was young, but she wasn't naive. She could tell when something was wrong, even if she didn't fully understand it. And as much as he wanted to shield her from moments like this, he knew that wasn't how the world worked. "She doesn't even know me," Olivia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "So why is she acting like that?" Jonathan took a slow breath. "Sometimes, people judge others before they even speak to them," he explained. "Not because of anything you did, but because of their own ideas about the world." Olivia frowned. "That doesn't seem fair." "It's not," he agreed. But that's why it's important to pay attention to how people treat others when they think no one is watching. Olivia thought about that for a moment, then turned toward her father. So what are you gonna do? Jonathan gave a small smile. You'll see. As the flight continued, Jonathan noticed that the atmosphere in first class remained relaxed. No one else seemed to notice the subtle tension between him and Ms. Lauren. To the other passengers, this was just another smooth flight. But Jonathan knew that was about to change. About an hour later, Ms. Lauren passed by again, this time checking on a well-dressed businessman seated a few rows ahead. She leaned in slightly, her voice softer and friendlier than it had been with Jonathan or Olivia. "Would you like anything else to drink, sir?" she asked with a warm smile. The man nodded. "Another glass of wine, please." "Of course," she said cheerfully. As she turned to head back to the galley, Jonathan spoke up. "Excuse me, Ms. Lauren." She stiffened slightly but quickly masked it with a professional expression as she turned toward him. "Yes, sir." Jonathan gestured toward Olivia. "I believe my daughter asked for some juice earlier. Is there a reason she wasn't served?" Ms. Lauren's smile was tight, forced. "I'm sorry, sir. We ran out." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "You ran out?" "Yes," she said quickly. "We have limited stock on each flight." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Interesting. Because I just watched you offer wine to another passenger." Ms. Lauren hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray in her hands. "Well, that's different, sir. We always ensure there's enough for our premium passengers." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And we're not premium passengers?" Ms. Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it again, realizing she had walked straight into a corner. Jonathan didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger, but the way he looked at her made it clear he was waiting for a real answer. For the first time, she looked nervous. Jonathan let the silence hang between them before speaking again, his voice even but firm. "Ms. Lauren, do you know who I am?" Her expression flickered with something unreadable, but she recovered quickly. "You're a valued customer, sir," she said smoothly. Jonathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I own this airline." The color drained from Ms. Lauren's face. Her posture stiffened, and for a brief second, she looked genuinely speechless. She glanced toward Olivia, then back at Jonathan, as if trying to process what she had just heard. Jonathan didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He let the weight of his words sink in. Ms. Lauren had spent the entire flight treating his daughter differently, assuming there would be no consequences. But now, she was realizing just how wrong she had been. And Jonathan wasn't done yet. Ms. Lauren's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding, her knuckles turning slightly white. For the first time during the flight, she looked genuinely uncertain. Jonathan could see the gears turning in her mind, the silent calculations she was making. She had treated him and Olivia as if they were just another set of passengers, ones she could ignore without consequence. Now, she was realizing her mistake. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Other passengers were starting to take notice. A man a few rows back glanced over, curious. A woman across the aisle lowered her magazine slightly, her eyes flicking between Jonathan and Ms. Lauren. The cabin was no longer as relaxed as it had been. Ms. Lauren forced a tight smile, attempting to regain her composure. I didn't realize, sir," she said, her voice softer now. "I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding." Jonathan didn't react immediately. He simply observed her, his calm gaze unwavering. Olivia shifted beside him, watching the exchange with wide eyes. She could feel the shift in the air, the way her father's presence had subtly but powerfully changed the situation. "A misunderstanding," Jonathan repeated slowly, his voice measured. "Is that what this was?" Ms. Lauren swallowed, clearly struggling to find the right response. Of course, sir. I would never." She stopped herself, her usually smooth confidence faltering. Jonathan remained quiet for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. Then, with a slight nod, he gestured toward Olivia. "Then let's fix it," he said simply. "My daughter asked for juice, and I expect her to be treated the same as any other passenger." Ms. Lauren hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. Jonathan caught it. Olivia caught it. The tension in the air thickened even more. Finally, she forced another smile, one that no longer held the same arrogance it had earlier. "Of course, sir. I'll get it right away." She turned quickly, walking toward the galley with stiff movements. Jonathan watched her go, then glanced down at Olivia, who was staring up at him with something close to amazement. "You didn't even get mad," she whispered. Jonathan smiled slightly. "You don't always have to raise your voice to be heard." A few minutes later, Ms. Lauren returned, holding a small cup of apple juice. This time, there was no hesitation as she handed it to Olivia. "Here you go, sweetie," she said, her voice overly sweet, like she was trying too hard to correct herself. Olivia took the juice but didn't say anything. She simply looked at her father, as if waiting for his reaction. Jonathan gave her a small nod, letting her know it was okay. Ms. Lauren lingered for a moment, as if expecting Jonathan to say something else, to confirm whether or not she had fixed the situation. But he didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. She cleared her throat and quickly turned away, moving down the aisle as if eager to escape the moment. Jonathan knew this wasn't over. Fixing one moment of rudeness didn't erase what had already happened. Ms. Lauren had revealed who she truly was when she thought no one important was watching. And now, she was scrambling to cover her tracks. Olivia took a sip of her juice, then looked at her father again. "So, now what?" Jonathan chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Now," he repeated. "Now we wait." The rest of the flight continued, but the energy had shifted. Ms. Lauren no longer held the same confident stride she had before. She moved through the cabin carefully, avoiding Jonathan's gaze whenever she passed. The young flight attendant who had been hesitant earlier seemed more relaxed now, though she still stole nervous glances in Ms. Lauren's direction. Jonathan remained patient. He wasn't the type to make a scene. He believed in handling things the right way, with purpose and precision. As the plane began its descent, Olivia peered out the window, watching as the city lights came into view below. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she trusted her father completely. Ms. Lauren, on the other hand, was unaware that the moment she stepped off this plane, her entire world was about to change. As the plane descended lower, the cabin filled with the usual chatter of passengers preparing for landing. Overhead bins clicked shut, seat belts snapped into place, and the gentle hum of anticipation filled the air. But Jonathan remained still, his expression calm, his focus sharp. He could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. Ms. Lauren moved through the aisle, double-checking seat belts with a forced politeness that hadn't been there before. She still hadn't met Jonathan's eyes again. She was trying to move past the incident, pretending it was just a small moment that had been smoothed over. But Jonathan knew better. Olivia finished the last sip of her juice and set the cup aside. "Are you gonna tell someone?" she asked, her voice low, as if they were sharing a secret. Jonathan smiled slightly. "I don't have to." Olivia frowned, confused, but before she could ask what he meant, the pilot's voice came over the speakers, announcing their final descent. The wheels touched the runway with a gentle thud, and as the plane taxied toward the gate, Ms. Lauren's posture stiffened. The closer they got to the terminal, the more nervous she looked. She smoothed down her uniform, stole a glance toward Jonathan, then quickly looked away. Passengers began gathering their belongings as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off. The usual scramble to exit first class played out around them, but Jonathan didn't move. He wasn't in a rush. Instead, he simply watched as Ms. Lauren took her place near the front of the cabin, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes flickering toward the jet bridge. The moment the door opened, something changed. A man in a dark suit stepped aboard, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was tall, confident, and clearly belonged there. But it wasn't just his presence that caught Ms. Lauren's attention, it was the small silver pin on his lapel, the unmistakable insignia of the airline's corporate division. Her breath hitched. The man's sharp eyes scanned the cabin until they landed on Jonathan. A subtle nod passed between them, one that didn't need words to be understood. Then, the man's gaze shifted toward Ms. Lauren, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Lauren," he said smoothly, his voice carrying enough weight to make her shoulders tense. "A word, please." Passengers nearby paused, some pretending not to listen but clearly paying attention. Ms. Lauren's forced smile faltered, and she nodded stiffly. "Oh, of course." Jonathan glanced at Olivia, who was watching the moment unfold with wide eyes. He leaned in and whispered, "Sometimes, the right people are already watching." Olivia grinned, finally understanding. As Ms. Lauren followed the suited man toward the jet bridge, her steps hesitant, Jonathan stood and grabbed his carry-on. He didn't need to see what happened next. He already knew. But just as he turned to leave, another voice stopped him. "Sir." Jonathan turned to find the young flight attendant, the one who had hesitated earlier. She looked nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." Jonathan gave her a kind smile. "It's never too late to do the right thing." She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly, and Jonathan could tell that she had learned something today, too. As he and Olivia stepped off the plane, the air felt lighter. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was quiet, unfolding in the spaces where people thought no one was watching. And for Ms. Lauren, the real consequences were just beginning. As Jonathan and Olivia stepped into the bustling terminal, the bright lights overhead cast a glow over the sea of travelers moving in different directions. Olivia clutched her father's hand, still processing everything that had happened. She had never seen someone so confident unravel the way Ms. Lauren had. It was like watching a storm lose its strength before it could do any real damage. Jonathan led Olivia toward the baggage claim, walking at a steady pace, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But just as they reached the carousel, a familiar voice, strained and desperate, cut through the noise behind them. "Mr. Reynolds, please." Jonathan turned slowly. Ms. Lauren stood a few feet away, her once pristine uniform slightly wrinkled, her usual composed demeanor shattered. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and for the first time, she looked unsure of herself. The confident, dismissive flight attendant was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just been confronted with the consequences of her own actions. Jonathan met her eyes, his face unreadable. Olivia looked up at her father, waiting to see how he would respond. Ms. Lauren took a hesitant step forward, lowering her voice. I didn't know who you were. If I had, I would have." She stopped herself, realizing too late that she was about to make the same mistake again. Jonathan let out a small sigh, shaking his head. "That's the problem, isn't it?" His voice was calm, but firm. "You shouldn't treat people differently based on who they are. You shouldn't need to know someone's status to show them basic respect." Ms. Lauren swallowed hard, her face pale. I made a mistake. I understand that now." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. He could see the fear in her eyes, not just fear of losing her job, but fear of being exposed for what she had done. She wasn't apologizing because she had suddenly become a better person. She was apologizing because she had been caught. "I don't hold grudges, Ms. Lauren," Jonathan said finally. "But I do believe in accountability." She flinched at the word. "I don't make hiring and firing decisions for the airline," he continued, his voice even. "But I do set the standard. And right now, the company is reviewing whether you meet that standard." Ms. Lauren's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but she stopped herself. She looked down for a moment, then back at Jonathan, her expression unreadable. I understand, she whispered. Jonathan gave her a small nod. He wasn't angry, he never had been. He had simply wanted her to realize that actions had consequences. And today, she had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Ms. Lauren turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Olivia exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath. So, that's it. Jonathan smiled down at her. That's it. But just as they were about to turn back to the baggage carousel, another voice interrupted them. This time, a warm and familiar one. Well, I must say, that was quite the show. Jonathan turned to see an older man with salt and pepper hair approaching them. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his sharp eyes filled with amusement. It was Mr. Harrison, the CEO of the airline himself. Olivia's eyes widened. She had seen him in magazines and on TV, but she had never met him in person. Jonathan, Mr. Harrison said with a knowing smile. I heard there was some excitement on the flight. Jonathan chuckled softly. You could say that. Mr. Harrison nodded, then glanced in the direction Ms. Lauren had walked away. We'll handle things on our end, he said. But more importantly, I wanted to thank you for reminding us all what really matters. Jonathan extended his hand, and Mr. Harrison shook it firmly. Olivia beamed as she watched the exchange. She had always known her father was important, but today she had seen it in a different way. He wasn't just powerful, he was fair. He didn't demand respect, he earned it. As they finally grabbed their luggage and headed toward the exit, Olivia looked up at her father with a proud smile. Dad. Yeah. When I grow up, I want to be just like you. Jonathan's heart swelled with warmth. He squeezed her hand gently. You already are. And with that, they stepped out into the fresh air, leaving the past behind them, knowing that some lessons, once learned, could never be forgotten. As Jonathan and Olivia stepped outside the terminal, the crisp evening air brushed against their faces. The city lights twinkled in the distance, their warm glow reflecting in Olivia's wide, thoughtful eyes. She was still holding her father's hand, swinging it gently as they walked toward the car waiting at the curb. Jonathan could tell she was deep in thought, absorbing everything that had happened. Dad, she finally said, glancing up at him, do you think she's really sorry? Jonathan exhaled slowly, considering the question. I think she's sorry she got caught, he admitted. But real change takes time. Sometimes, people don't realize the way they treat others until they face the consequences. Olivia nodded, as if she understood. Do you think she'll change? Jonathan gave her a small smile. That's up to her. They reached the sleek black car parked by the curb, and the driver, a kind-faced man in his 40s, stepped out to greet them. Good evening, Mr. Reynolds, he said with a nod before opening the door. Jonathan helped Olivia into the car, then slid in beside her. As the vehicle pulled away from the airport, she rested her head against the seat, her mind still racing. I don't get it, she murmured. Why would someone act one way to some people and another way to others? Shouldn't you just be nice to everyone? Jonathan chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. You'd think so. But sometimes, people judge others before they even get to know them. They assume things based on appearances, and that's where they go wrong. Olivia frowned. That's not fair. No, it's not, Jonathan agreed. And that's why it's important to stand up for what's right. Not by yelling or getting angry, but by showing people that kindness and respect should never depend on who someone is. Olivia smiled at that, clearly proud of the way her father had handled everything. You didn't have to tell her who you were, did you? Jonathan shook his head. No, I didn't. But sometimes, people need a reminder that their actions have consequences. The city streets blurred past them as they made their way home. Olivia yawned, her energy finally winding down after the long flight and unexpected events of the day. She leaned against her father's arm, her small fingers still wrapped around his. Dad? She murmured sleepily. Yeah. I think today was kind of like a lesson. Jonathan smiled. What kind of lesson? She thought for a moment before answering. That people should always be kind no matter what, and that sometimes you don't have to shout to make things right. Jonathan's heart swelled with pride. That's a good lesson, sweetheart. As the car pulled up to their house, the driver stepped out and opened the door. Jonathan carefully lifted Olivia into his arms, feeling the weight of her small body as she nuzzled into his shoulder. She was exhausted, but in the best way, the kind of tired that came after learning something valuable. He carried her inside, tucking her into bed and smoothing the blankets over her. Just as he was about to turn off the lamp, Olivia's sleepy voice piped up again. Dad. Jonathan smiled. Yeah. I think you're the best dad in the world. He chuckled softly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. And I think you're the best daughter in the world. She smiled, her eyes fluttering shut. Within moments, she was fast asleep. Jonathan stood by her bed for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her small chest. He thought about everything that had happened today, the way Ms. Lauren had looked at Olivia, the hesitation in the young flight attendant's eyes, the moment of realization when everything shifted. He wasn't angry. He never had been. But he knew that moments like this were important, because they weren't just about one flight, one interaction, or one mistake. They were about setting an example, teaching the next generation what truly mattered. As he turned off the light and stepped out of Olivia's room, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Some battles didn't need to be fought with words or aggression. Sometimes, the strongest response was simply showing people a better way. And if today had taught Ms. Lauren anything, it was that respect wasn't something you reserved for the people you thought mattered. It was something you gave freely because everyone mattered. With that thought, Jonathan headed to his own room, ready to close the chapter on today. Because tomorrow was a new day, and the lessons learned today would carry forward, shaping the world in ways even he couldn't predict.